My name is David Phillips, and I'm the director of the program on peace building and human rights at Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. We're extensively involved in affairs concerning Sudan and have had the opportunity to welcome at Columbia a series of special envoys over the years. Today, we're honored to have Ambassador Donald Booth join us for this teleconference. We've got quite an audience online. It's different than sitting in a lecture hall at Columbia. We have a global audience. Everyone's very interested to hear from Ambassador Booth what you have to say about normalizing U.S. relations with Sudan, and also particularly for Sudanese diaspora, what helpful role they can play. Ambassador Booth is a three-time U.S. ambassador to Liberia, Ethiopia, and Zambia. He served as the special envoy for Sudan and South Sudan from February 2013 until January of 2017. Then he was given a much needed break, but the US government in its wisdom brought him back into service after the June 3 massacre, and he was appointed again the special envoy for Sudan. And in that role, he's made a pivotal and important contribution to events in the country at a moment of opportunity, but also a moment of great challenge. So we're very happy to welcome you, Ambassador Booth, today. Because we have many people on the line, the format for our discussion will be a presentation. I'll follow it up with some questions, and then the participants in our Zoom conference have sent in questions of their own. So I fielded those questions and I'll present them to you. And I know you have a busy afternoon, so we're going to try to end as close to 1 p.m. as possible. So without any further delay, my pleasure and privilege to welcome Ambassador Donald Booth, Special Envoy for Sudan. Don, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David. And thanks to Columbia University's Peace Building and Rights Program for this opportunity to discuss the rebuilding, or I would actually prefer to call it the building of a new U.S.-Sudan relationship following the ouster of President Omar al-Bashir and the formation of a civilian-led transitional government. And I'd also like to thank all of the participants who have joined us today for this discussion. Now, I suggest the term building a new relationship rather than rebuilding the bilateral relationship because I've had some long experience with Sudan. I worked on Sudan as the State Department's Sudan desk officer back in the early 1980s, before the imposition of Sharia and before the start of the Second Anyanya Rebellion in the south of Sudan. At that time, we had a very good relationship with President Jafar Numeri's government. But that type of relationship, I believe, is insufficient to build the lasting bonds of friendship and shared values that we and the people of Sudan really should have. It's no secret that the US was no friend of President Bashir and his government, which repressed and waged war on its own citizens, as well as destabilized neighboring states. But we've long supported the aspirations of the Sudanese people, their aspirations for peace, justice, freedom, and democracy, the slogans of the revolution. We also spent hundreds of millions of dollars annually to provide life-saving assistance to Sudanese refugees and IDPs and others. Over the years, the US imposed sanctions to press the government of Sudan for a major reduction in Sudan's internal armed conflicts, to get it to open up to greater humanitarian access, and to stop fomenting conflicts in the region. And the lifting of US economic sanctions in 2017 was intended to help the Sudanese people. At the same time, it revealed that it was Bashir's wars and economic policies, the crony capitalism, the rent seeking by the elite, and the untargeted subsidies that were impoverishing Sudan, not US sanctions. When anti-Bashir protests erupted again in December 2018, the United States welcomed the women and youth-led nonviolent, and I stress that, nonviolent movement's aim to achieve political change in Sudan. Our embassy was criticized for visiting the sit-in site near Army headquarters and for distributing medical supplies to the demonstrators. In May last year, while the people were still struggling to achieve civilian rule, we organized the Friends of Sudan group in an effort to coordinate efforts by Sudan's key international partners to prevent another civil war and to help negotiate a peaceful transition to civilian rule. We encouraged and supported the mediation efforts of the African Union and Ethiopia, as well as renewed direct dialogue between the Forces for Freedom and Change and the Transitional Military Council to try to avoid a repeat of the tragic events of June 3rd during the massive June 30 demonstrations. We warmly welcome the formation of the civilian-led transitional government. In fact, I signed as a witness on behalf of the Troika, which is the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Kingdom of Norway, to witness the political declaration that served as the basis for the constitutional decree and the transitional government. The United States government recognized these were not perfect documents, but they were accepted by most Sudanese as the basis for a peaceful transition. Since Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok's appointment, we've worked closely and collaboratively with him and his government. He and his civilian ministers tell us repeatedly that they are working well with the Sovereign Council, which is currently chaired by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. But the building of a new U.S. Sudan relationship remains a work in progress. The nature of the relationship will depend on the progress Sudan makes in fulfilling the aspirations of its peaceful revolution, the progress it makes in securing peace, freedom, and justice for all of Sudan's people, and in establishing inclusive and permanent democratic institutions. The nature of the new relationship will also be shaped in part by the views and actions of the Sudanese diaspora in the United States. We believe the civilian-led transitional government offers the best chance in more than a generation to address the center-periphery divide that has kept Sudanese at war with each other for decades, to implement structural economic reforms that will give Sudan's youth a chance for a better future, and to achieve some accountability for past crimes against the Sudanese people. The United States recognizes monumental changes have occurred and are continuing in Sudan, though much more can be achieved. The morality police are gone. Christians can celebrate Christmas openly. The press is much freer. Humanitarian aid is allowed to cross international boundaries from South Sudan into the two areas. The budget now prioritizes social services, and great progress has been made in the peace talks. The United States has responded to these changes. We welcomed Prime Minister Hamdok to Washington in December. That was the first visit by a senior Sudanese official in over 34 years. We've decided to enhance our diplomatic engagement to the ambassadorial level. We removed Sudan from the list of countries of particular concern in response to progress made on religious freedom. And we increased our non-humanitarian assistance eightfold from the 2018 level, while remaining the largest humanitarian assistance provider, contributing more than 50% of the Sudan budgets of both the World Food Program and UNICEF in recent years. More importantly, the approach to the relationship has changed from a transactional one with the Bashir regime to one where we are cooperating with a government that shares similar objectives with us for peace in the periphery, improving the lives of Sudanese, promoting regional stability, and ensuring freedom for all. We are working to enshrine this new approach in a formal policy document. But creating a new relationship requires addressing decades of restrictions imposed on what we can do in Sudan. Some restrictions are Sudan specific, such as restrictions on U.S. foreign assistance that appear in the Annual Appropriations Act, while others pertain to issue areas which Sudan will need to make progress, such as assistance restriction tied to the unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers, and arrears in debt payments. We are talking with Congress about the array of restrictions on our assistance and how we might respond to positive progress made by the civilian-led transitional government. We recognize the challenges facing Sudan and have been engaged productively on a wide range of issues, from the peace process underway in Juba to religious freedom to addressing economic challenges, including the additional ones posed by the COVID-19 crisis. Our COVID-19 response to date has totaled roughly $13.7 million for Sudan, and we expect there will be additional COVID response funding in the coming weeks and months. So let me conclude by saying, as I like to, and that is that I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic we will achieve a productive new relationship because the momentum in Sudan for positive change is backed by the Sudanese people. And the more we see positive change in Sudan, the more the support there will be in the United States for positive engagement and support. So with that, I thank you, and we can turn to questions. I'm briefly going to stand up and close the door just to cut down on some background noise.
So thank you very much, Ambassador Booth. I'm going to ask some questions based on our previous conversations, and then I've received many questions from persons who have registered for this, so I'll identify them by name and their question to you. My first question has to do with Sudan on the list of U.S. state sponsors of terrorism. Can you explain to us the difference between sanctions that were lifted in 2017 and Sudan's continued stigmatization on the SST list? What steps have to be taken by Sudan to get off the list? And is there a timetable for that?
Okay, well, let me try to explain it as simply as I can. The sanctions that were removed in 2017 were sanctions that affected the ability of the private sector, banks, companies, to do business with Sudanese entities. Those sanctions were removed in 2017, and the only sanctions that remain are sanctions on a few individuals and entities that were imposed as a result of the atrocities in Darfur by the United Nations Security Council. The state sponsor of terrorism designation resulted from evidence of, indeed, Sudan's support for international terrorism. What the state sponsor of terrorism affects is the ability of the United States to provide assistance directly to the government of Sudan, and our ability to support programs by the international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. We cannot support their activities in Sudan. So at this point, let me be as clear as I can about this. There are no US restrictions on US companies, US banks, third country banks and companies doing business in Sudan. The state sponsor of terrorism designation only restricts what the United States government itself can do vis-a-vis Sudan.
So I forgot to mention in my introduction, Don, that this meeting's on the record. And I know that this designation as a state sponsor of terrorism touches on sensitive issues. Is there a list of steps that Khartoum needs to take to get off the list? And what's the timetable for that to happen?
Well, removal of Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list, or rescission as we call it, requires that Sudan meet both statutory and policy requirements. The key factor is that there can't be any support for international terrorism by any part of the Sudanese government. And that's a factual issue, and that's something that requires serious due diligence to ensure that we get that right. There are also the involvement of Congress is required by law in this, and that Congress can block the rescission of SST. So we have certain policy requirements as well, which we have engaged the Sudanese government on. Those policy requirements I am not able to go into in detail today, but let me suffice to say that I think our engagement with Sudan has been very productive on that. I'd just like to quote what Secretary Pompeo said about a month and a half ago. You know, he said, "We've been looking at whether to lift the designation of the state sponsor of terrorism in Sudan for some time." Indeed, we have been engaged in this process for a while. We remain in active discussion with the government on the statutory and policy criteria. And unfortunately, I'm not able to answer the question on timeline. It's one that I get from many people. It really will depend on when the administration believes that those statutory and policy criteria have been met. It's a decision of the president to make the recommendation or to inform the Congress of his intention. So that will happen when the administration is indeed satisfied that the statutory and policy requirements have been met.
And you know that Columbia University has been involved in transitional justice, and that we're working with the University of Khartoum and the Darfur Bar Association to share information and build capacity. When I was in Sudan, first days of February, with my colleagues Hassan El-Tajani and Mufadal Mufadal, we learned almost immediately after that the government of Sudan would, quote, cooperate with the ICC.
Mm-hmm.
What does that really mean? What does cooperation entail?
Well, that's a very good question. The issue of cooperation with the ICC, particularly in relation to President Bashir, came up in the context of the peace negotiations underway in Juba. And it was first put on the table a few months ago by Sovereign Council member Al-Atashi, who was the government's lead negotiator for the Darfur element of the peace talks. What we have heard since, because we've obviously been intrigued by what that means, what we have been told in Khartoum is that the thinking there is that there would be cooperation with the ICC on those people who had already been facing indictments, including President Bashir, but that it did not mean the transfer of those individuals to The Hague. As far as I'm aware, that has not been further defined in recent weeks, probably a lot having to do with the COVID crisis. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, sorry.
We hit a little bump in the road, but you're back.
Okay. So as I was saying, I think there hasn't been any new news on this in the last month. That could well be because of the, of course, increasing focus on the COVID crisis. I know that in talking with the Darfuri opposition groups who are negotiating in Juba, I've met with them on several occasions. The last time was in early February in Juba. That the issue of accountability and transitional justice are both on their agenda in negotiation with the government. And I think this offer by the government to involve the ICC helped alleviate the concerns of the Darfuri opposition in that regard.
At Columbia, we've done research on the operations of hybrid courts in
Okay.
similar settings. So when we get to a point where such information would be useful to you, don't hesitate to turn to us. We have some useful insights to share.
Okay. Again, we're not sure that hybrid court is exactly what they had in mind, but we'll definitely keep that in mind.
You mentioned the peace process. How's that going? And where do you see it going from here?
Um, I participated or engaged in my last iteration as envoy in several iterations of peace negotiations that were mediated at the time between the Bashir government and the what became the Sudan Revolutionary Front, the SRF, of the main Darfuri opposition groups and the SPLM North. They were mediated by President Mbeki on behalf of the African Union. Those talks made, at best, incremental progress over the space of months. Since the peace negotiations between the transitional government and the armed opposition groups began in October in Juba, I would say the pace of progress has been dramatic. There have also been representatives of non-armed opposition from the north of Sudan, from the center, basically the Gezira area, and also the east, which have been negotiating their grievances as well. And framework agreements have been completed with those three regional groups. Framework agreement has been agreed with the SPLM North faction led by Malik Agar. The Darfuris are on what I would say is the last major substantive area of discussion, which is the security arrangements. And so it is conceivable that there could be indeed a very positive outcome from Juba in the not too distant future. However, there has been much less progress made in talks between the SPLM North faction led by Abdulaziz Al-Hilu. He has engaged in the talks in Juba, but the talks have not progressed to specific areas. For example, the areas they've been discussing have included resettlement of IDPs, refugees, wealth sharing, power sharing, the creation of a regional level governments throughout Sudan, transitional justice. Those are all issues that the Darfuris and the SPLM North Agar faction are far along on. The Al-Hilu faction has continued to insist that the transitional government find a way of declaring that Sudan is and will be a secular state, which the transitional government's response has been the issue of secularism or the role of Sharia in the country is fundamentally something that should be settled in the new constitution, which is to be drafted during the transitional period. They have pointed out that they have made changes to many laws that have greatly increased religious freedom, that have greatly restricted the application of Sharia. But that sort of retail approach to the issue has not satisfied the SPLM North Al-Hilu faction. The other thing that they've pushed is the idea of self-determination, so that if Sudan does not turn out to be the Sudan that they perceive, they would like the option of self-determination, which in effect means independence. And that, I have tried to convince them, is not something that either the United States or others would support. So the negotiations there are continuing, but they are not making the type of progress we would have hoped. Then there's also the group led by Abdul Wahid Al-Nur. He's a Fur leader. The people that support him generally in the area of Jebel Mara, which is an area that's probably the least or most insecure in Darfur at this point. He remains in exile in Paris, and while he has had some discussions with the Prime Minister, he has not agreed to engage in peace talks. So one of the things that I had discussed with the transitional government is that the peace talks are great, and there should be definitely a focus on getting to agreements. But the more important thing is actually addressing the root causes of the problems. So some of those obviously are being discussed in the negotiations, but there is certainly the option for the government simply to move forward and address those root causes, should leaders like Abdullah had not come to the table.
What role is the U.S. government, and are you personally playing in the peace process? Are there others that are mediating, or are you also involved?
The South Sudanese government is the official mediation. They are being supported technically by the United Nations. And I have, as I said, I was in Juba in early February. A member of my team here in Washington, who has worked many years with the peace processes, various peace processes in Sudan, has been heavily engaged, has spent a good part of time over the last, since October, in Juba, where the negotiations are underway, working with the opposition groups and the government delegation and the mediation. And we have also engaged an NGO to provide facilitation where the different parties need it. It's not a mediation role, but it's to help the individual parties should they need it. Other international partners have been there. The European Union has had people there at times, Norway, Germany, the UK. So there has been international sort of observation of this, but I would say the United States has been the most engaged by far of any of the international partners outside of Africa.
Let me ask you a couple of quick questions about governance and then the economy. How is the formation of the Transitional Legislative Council progressing? And are we also seeing the appointment of civilian governors?
These are two very important points you raised, David. The constitutional decree called for the formation of the Transitional Legislative Council within 3 months of the formation of the government. So it should have been done by December. Unfortunately, it still remains unformed. Just to give some background, the agreement was that 2/3 of the members, that is 200 of the 300 members, would be appointed upon the recommendation of the Forces for Freedom and Change. And the other 100 members would come from others than those recommended by the Forces for Freedom and Change, but not spelled out as to exactly who or how they would be nominated and appointed. The delay has, I think, has two causes. The main one is that the armed opposition groups thought they had an agreement back in the summer with the Forces for Freedom and Change that the Legislative Council would not be formed until there was a peace agreement and they could participate. They want to be in on the ground floor of this transitional legislature, on the ground floor when its rules of procedure are written, when its committees are formed, when its chairman is chosen. And so the armed opposition has been strongly opposed to the formation of the Legislative Council. We've cautioned them that since the negotiations for a peace agreement have gone beyond the 6 months, which was stipulated in the Constitution, that really it is unreasonable to hold up the formation of the Legislative Council. And the latest information we have from Khartoum is that there's now renewed momentum to trying to get that council formed. That will also require, though, the coordination among the various and not always on the same page members of the Forces for Freedom and Change to come up with the 200 names that will ultimately be seated on that council. And as I said, the other 100, it remains still unclear exactly how they'll be named. The governors, again, the delay has been, I think, problematic. What we hear is that since the military governors that have been in place since the fall of Bashir remain in the states, that people frankly aren't seeing, a lot of change. You see a lot of change in Khartoum, but less so outside of Khartoum. And so again, we think the appointment of the civilian governors, who will then bring in their civilian cabinets, which will be presumably much more representative of local interests, will then give the people in the periphery or outside of Khartoum in general the sense that people close to them are in charge of their states and are looking out for their interests. So we have been pushing for the appointment of these governors, urging the transitional government to do that. We understand that the plan is now within a week or two to appoint civilian governors, at least on a temporary basis, leaving open the idea that once peace agreements are signed, that some of the governors may be changed with from among those who are in the what the armed opposition calls the peace bloc, so that they would get also some representation at the state governance level. But two very important things that need to happen for the transition to move forward. Some of the committees that were foreseen in the constitutional decree need to be formed by the Transitional Legislative Council. So they're not formed yet as a result.
During political transition, people often seek a peace dividend. So what can you tell us about economic reform and whether or not the people of Sudan feel as though there's some payoff for their sacrifice?
Well, there's a huge payoff in terms of their individual freedoms. But the economy that was inherited by the transitional government, unfortunately, was an economy that was totally ruined by the Bashir government over many, many years. It's an economy that has unsustainable levels of untargeted commodity subsidies, roughly the equivalent of 12% of GDP, or about 38% of the government budget goes to untargeted subsidies for things like wheat and fuel. The petroleum products are particularly costly as a subsidy, and also particularly susceptible to misdirection, to being smuggled. So therefore, it's really an unsustainable drain on the Sudanese budget and economy. They also inherited a system of about 5 different exchange rates, all differing from the market determined rate. And so what this opened up was great opportunities for rent seeking and favoritism. And so again, trying to fix these exchange rates is important, as is eliminating, or at least vastly reducing, the untargeted subsidies. Now, unfortunately, the results of reforms in both of those areas will lead to price increases. And of course, with the COVID-19 crisis, with more people unable to make their daily living, this puts an even greater burden on the Sudanese people, particularly the poorest of the Sudanese people. This government, however, unlike the Bashir government, is taking seriously the social compact with the Sudanese people, and has already launched now in the greater Khartoum area, and is planning to roll out, as long as its resources allow, support in terms of food baskets for those who live on a day-to-day basis, and small cash transfers for those who are affected by either job losses and or the rising prices. The government is in the process now of revising its budget for 2020, and we're told that in that revised budget will be greater clarity on its plans for addressing the types of economic reforms that are needed. But what's also needed is very clear communication from the government to the people that yes, there will be greater reform. We're doing what we can to mitigate some of the impact on our most vulnerable citizens because we care about you, but there is no alternative other than to make these types of changes.
Don, let's now turn to questions that we've received from the audience. And I'll share those questions with you. We've got a lot of people who have raised their hand, but just to be able to manage the volume of interest during this call, I've already screened many of those questions. I should say in advance that we had a large number of questions having to do with SST. Since you've already addressed that to the extent that you're able, I won't go through that with you again, but let's then turn to other questions that are relevant to your portfolio. So we hear a question from Hassan Gadkarim, who asks, what role can the diaspora play to help normalize relations?
Well, again, I would go to building a new and better relationship than we've ever had with Sudan. And I think certainly the Sudanese diaspora in the U.S., as I said, has a role to play in that. Many of you are now here as citizens, dual nationals, or green card holders, so you have access to our political system and can engage your representatives. I think it's important that your voices are heard. This is why my office is engaged in a rolling series of discussions with the diaspora, because we want to take your views and concerns into account. We hear sort of two main themes, I would say, from the diaspora. One is along the lines of some of the questions that have been asked today of, why aren't you moving to do more to help this transitional government? And the other theme is, why are you engaging when some of the people who are responsible for past atrocities are still part of this government? So getting that balance right is difficult, but we believe that what you have now in Sudan is a compromise. The transitional government is a compromise. Neither the civilians who were in the streets for months, nor the military who were instrumental in actually getting President Bashir out of office, neither of them really sort of won an outright victory. They compromised to form this transitional government. And all the indications that we have from both sides is that they're working well together. And so that's why we continue to engage with this transitional government, because we believe it truly does want to achieve the aims of the revolution. And the diaspora can help also in Sudan. Some of the Sudanese that I've engaged in government ministries of late have been Sudanese who have returned from abroad, Sudanese who are bringing their skills back with them, people who know our system and can better advise the transitional government on how to work with us beyond just my office and the State Department. So I think there are many different roles the diaspora can play. Clearly, the remittances from the diaspora are important to the Sudanese economy and will continue to be for some time. But I think really what you are fundamentally is that personal bridge between our two countries, our two cultures, and that anything you can do to educate your fellow Americans here in the U.S. Of why Sudan is important, what the aspirations are, and that the aspirations of the Sudanese and American people really are pretty much one and the same.
We've worked very closely with the diaspora, and we'll continue to do so. in service of the goals that you just articulated. I have a follow-up question from Mufadal, and it has to do with funds from the Sudanese diaspora to help COVID victims and coronavirus prevention. Is there a loophole in SST for humanitarian aid? And how can the diaspora channel funds to partners in country for this purpose?
Well, again, the SST designation, it doesn't need a humanitarian loophole because it doesn't restrict any humanitarian assistance or transfer of funds from the diaspora. So it really is a non-factor, other than the fact that most banks still are de-risking in Sudan. They still, even without SST, have very strict know your customer requirements. So this requires due diligence and work by their legal departments. And for the amounts of money involved, they have, to date, most banks have not been willing to undertake the work, make the expense of trying to reestablish banking relations with Sudan. So this, I admit, does complicate the transfer of remittances or monies that you want to send back for COVID or whatever, any other purpose. The State Department, we have, to try to clarify this in circumstances, issued comfort letters to the extent we can, which basically say there are no sanctions, there is no prohibition on your doing this type of activity. We did that a while back when Sudan was trying to charter an aircraft to return, when Sudan was trying to charter an aircraft to return Sudanese citizens who were stuck in China when China was the center of the COVID-19 outbreak. And indeed, they were able to charter the aircraft and do that. We're looking at doing that again. We also have been doing some outreach with some of the money transfer companies to see if they might be more forward-leaning, because we know there is indeed a strong interest from the Sudanese diaspora here to be able to help their country in this time of crisis.
So we have several questions about transferring funds to Sudan and whether or not sanctions impede the transfer of those funds. I think you've addressed that in your previous response,
right,
but it may be useful to get some guidelines from your office or from the U.S. government about how monies can be transferred bank to bank or for humanitarian purposes. So if there is a document that provides a guideline, people would welcome it.
Well, it's the problem is there are no restrictions, and the problem is that the banks themselves don't want to be involved in that business, and we cannot force private banks, obviously, to engage in that type of business. As I said, we are engaging with some of the wire transfer companies to see if they might be more amenable to working to transfer funds to Sudan. If we, if they agree to engage in that, I'm sure that they would be happy to advertise their services. I think that would be the best way. For now, one other thing that people could consider, particularly if you're trying to send money to help generally with the COVID-19 response in Sudan, is that there are a number of international organizations, UN organizations, and private NGOs, which are indeed working on this crisis, that I'm sure would be happy to accept contributions earmarked for their Sudan program.
We have a question from Abdelaziz, Mohammed Abdelaziz, and it has to do with social media. He questions why U.S. technology companies, particularly Facebook, Google, and Twitter, block Sudan from using their platforms. And what can we do to encourage use of those platforms and electronic interaction?
Well, that's a good question, and again, without a good answer. I know firsthand, I've experienced being in Sudan and trying to rebuild a function on my phone and getting the message that this app is not available. Um, uh, the answer again, though, is that these are decisions made by private companies. And, you know, we can't force their hand on this. We have, I think, made it very clear that the sanctions were definitively lifted in 2017. There is no bar to their doing business. They don't face a a legal restriction in doing business, but it's going to take a while. And again, this is where the building of this new relationship is important, because perceptions are so important, and perceptions are often lagging indicators. And so the more that we can do to show normal interactions between the United States and Sudan, I think the more that private companies, like the tech companies, will realize, oh, there's a market there that we're missing out on. And then I think they will move in with alacrity. So, public visits, for example, by the Prime Minister, meetings he had with members of the U.S. business community, things that show that we're moving in a positive, normal direction are the things that will, I think, help move the needle when it comes to the decisions that private companies make.
We have a question from El Gaili from Harvard University. It has to do with stolen assets. Is the U.S. willing to assist Sudan with the tracing of stolen assets by members of the former regime?
The issue of stolen assets is something that we have indeed engaged with the transitional government on, going back to shortly after it came into office. The U.S. government can help, but we can only work on what might be in the United States. The most effective way of tracing stolen assets is through entities that have expertise to do that. And we have connected the transitional government with a number of those entities. And I understand they are in negotiations with at least one or two of them at this point to pursue these assets. So it is something the transitional government takes seriously, and something that the United States would cooperate on, and that we hope countries around the world will cooperate on. I'm rather, I think that this is something that's very important. However, it's not a magic bullet. It's not going to solve this year's budget problem. It takes a while not only to identify the assets, where they are. You have to then get them frozen. If they're outside of Sudan, which is where we assume a great deal of those assets are, you then have to work with each local government to get a legal injunction to freeze the assets. And then there's an even lengthier process usually in getting third country governments to agree that they were stolen and they should be sent back to the country of origin. And then there are usually conditions placed on how they are returned to ensure they're not simply stolen by the next government. So it's a lengthy process. I think in some countries, I know I've heard of a 10-year process. I've been told by some of the expert groups that it can be done in much shorter period. I hope they're right in the case of Sudan, because the Sudanese people certainly deserve access to what was stolen from them by a very corrupt regime.
Don, we've worked closely with Switzerland's former finance minister, and he has expertise in this area. So if a member of your team wants to be in touch with Colombia about this, we'd be pleased to facilitate some contact.
Yes, the Swiss, I know, have done work in this, as the World Bank has a capacity building program in this area. but the fastest way to get at it is with these professionals who do this for many countries around the world.
So we have a question also from El Gaili about the Janjaweed. Are they still active? Are they a destabilizing force in Sudan, in Libya? What can you tell us about their operations?
Well, I presume that when you refer to the Janjaweed, you're referring to the Rapid Support Forces at this point.
Yes,
Yes, they
he
are.
says AKA RSF, so that is to what he's referring.
Right. The Rapid Support Forces, they've evolved from Janjaweed to border guards to, I think there have been several other names in the interim. But they are indeed an important component of the security services of Sudan at this point. They are in Khartoum. They have been very visible in Khartoum in the past and during the summer when I was traveling there very frequently. Much less so on the streets now, but they're still there. They, along with the Sudanese Armed Forces and other security services, are an important component of ensuring that the former regime does not return. The former regime still has armed cadres, and so the civilian cabinet and hopefully the Transitional Legislative Council will need the support of the security services, including the RSF, to ensure that this transition can move forward. As I said earlier, the head of the RSF is part of the Sovereign Council, part of the military establishment, and all indications we have from Khartoum is that the relationship between the Prime Minister, the civilian cabinet, and the security establishment is working well. It is a collaborative engagement, and which needs to continue. That does mean that there aren't individuals or perhaps units of different parts of the security services that are sometimes implicated in bad activities. And the United States, though, will certainly look very unkindly toward any spoilers of this transition. Now, in terms of Libya, there was reporting from the UN panel of experts that there had been some RSF elements. We have engaged on that. The government has denied that officially. There have also been reports from the panel of experts of some of the Darfuri armed opposition, having some of their forces in Libya as well. The position the United States government takes, and that we've reiterated to government and opposition alike, is that all should respect the UN regime on Libya, which calls for no foreign fighters coming in. We think that simply is a recipe for destabilizing Libya. So we've encouraged that any Sudanese forces in or out of government that may be there should leave.
And when we were in Khartoum, we were told that the RSF played a very important role protecting the demonstrators on June 3. Is that your understanding?
Protecting or attacking?
Protecting.
Yes, at various times during the sit-in in front of military headquarters, both RSF and as well as SAF elements did protect demonstrators. There were also RSF elements that were seen partaking in the June 3rd crackdown. And the transitional government, one of the committees that was formed was a committee to investigate June 3rd specifically. It has extended its mandate from, I think his initial mandate was 3 months. It's been extended and is working. our then acting head of global criminal justice visited Khartoum in December and engaged with the head of that committee. We have some concerns about its capacity, and particularly in the lack of representation by women on the committee. Since many of the victims of June 3rd were women, we think that the committee should have a female component to it. We have not seen the outcome of that report, but it's absolutely important that there be a credible report that really gets to the bottom of what happened on June 3rd, because there were well over 100 martyrs that day. I will say one other thing, though, that the focus on June 3rd sometimes elicits, particularly from my Darfuri friends, a bit of ire, because they say, you know, this is Khartoum focusing on Khartoum again. What about the focus on us? And this gets us back to the issue that we talked about earlier, which is, you know, will those most responsible for atrocities in Darfur face justice, and the potential role of the ICC now in achieving that.
Don, since you brought up the role of women, we were all struck by the iconic image of a woman in Khartoum standing on top of a vehicle,
right,
speaking to the people.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about the role of women? What role are they currently playing, and how could they play a more expansive role?
Well, they certainly played a leading role on the streets from December up until the formation of the transitional government. As I said, it was women and youth led. And the constitutional declaration and political declaration, one of the key players on the Forces for Freedom and Change side was a woman lawyer. There are now in the cabinet, I think, 4 ministers, female ministers, sovereign council members. 40% of the Transitional Legislative Council is supposed to be female. We certainly hope that the FFC will live up to that commitment. We have tried to encourage more women's participation in the peace process. But as we encounter in many negotiations between armed groups, they say it's those of us fighting who need to be the ones here negotiating the peace. And since the women generally aren't the ones out there fighting, they are rarely included in the delegations. But it's an issue that we've pushed. There were women among the IDPs from Darfur who were brought to Juba to ground truth the peace talks. And I must say, just to go back to that issue briefly, one of the things that we were struck by was the IDPs actually coming in thinking that their issues weren't being addressed by the government and the armed groups. And after they had been there and learned everything that was on the table and being discussed, they actually didn't have sort of new issues to put out there. That indeed the range of issues of concern to them were on the table. And that includes also, of course, the role of women. We're not, we're not satisfied, obviously, with the role of women in the peace process to date. We certainly, as I said, hope that the role, the proportional representation of women foreseen in the Constitutional Declaration will be honored.
We have a lot of raised hands on the Zoom teleconference, but we won't be able to address those questions today. So I'd like to invite persons who have either statements or questions to send them by email to Columbia's office, and we can share those questions with you and your team. We've had a very rich discussion today. Don, your level of knowledge and expertise is extraordinary. Your caring for the Sudanese people and for the bilateral relationship, which has improved dramatically between Sudan and the United States, is also extraordinary. So I, for one, am very heartened knowing that you are playing this leadership role. And on behalf of all of our guests on the Zoom call today, I just want to say how grateful we are to you, not only for taking time to participate in this discussion, but for your work 24/7 to help Sudan transition from its dark period to a period where democracy and human rights and economic opportunity can prevail. So on behalf of everyone, thank you to Ambassador Booth. We're going to adjourn now, Don, so you can pick up your busy schedule with the next meeting. But on Columbia's behalf, thank you.
No, thank you so much again, David, for hosting me today. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to more questions, limitations of this format. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Don. Thank you, everybody, for
Thank you,
joining.
everybody.
We're now adjourned.